Hi, I'm Stephen Carson coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri, in these United States. Um, we are, after an introductory episode, we are now getting into the left wing terror series. And warning to children and faint of heart, we're kicking off with something that's pretty grim, pretty brutal stuff. Okay, please share the channel with friends and like the show. That helps. Also, we are supported by Subscribestar. I have had a technical problem where I wasn't showing my Subscribestar supporters in the credits at the end. I fixed that. It's up to date. It's fresh. It's showing all my supporters, active supporters. So you will see that at the end. Apologies to supporters for not having my act together there, but got together with the producer and sorted it out today. So excited about that. Also, we have a public Bitcoin wallet if you prefer to do things pseudo anonymously. Okay, let us go to Ryan Turnipseed. Hello.
Hello, how are you?
Pretty good. I think people might have you a little bit pigeonholed as American history, but I guess we'll find out today. But I gather that your interests in history are not entirely parochial, right?
Right, yeah. I
In particular, I remember we were talking about China on the show. I don't think you were on it. Talking about China, and then you mentioned to me off air or offline, hey, I kind of know a lot about China too. I was like, oh, okay.
yeah, I have a lot of interests in different parts of history that are
Yeah.
completely unrelated to even the whole new world. Just entirely relegated to the old world. Uh, so
Yeah.
not
I
just American.
and maybe I've missed it, Ryan, but and maybe I'm trying to pat myself on the back too much, but I'm kind of stunned that this humble channel is doing this series. It seems like, all these right wingers trying to outright wing each other all over the place. You're not a real right winger. I'm really right wing. You'd think they would have thought to do this. I mean, what could
Yeah.
be a more obvious topic than to do a roundup of left wing terror over the last couple centuries?
Right, yeah, that is a great point. We're the first ones to really do an entire overview, just delving right into specific details. But also, I'm very happy that we're the ones doing it because I have a feeling
Hmm.
if certain other people, not in our sphere, a bit more hostile to us, were to do this, they would lump in some people that we find to be friends and say they were actually left-wing terrorists at this point in time. There's plenty of
Perhaps
opportunity
so.
to slander someone in the series. I don't think you or I are intent on doing so.
Hey, got a super chat that's actually on the screen, so let's read it. Prince of Parma, thank you. G.A. Henty's No Surrender, A Tale of the Rising in Vendée, covers this topic for the younger audience in a historical novel form. Wow. Now, that is not something I would have thought about writing for the kids. Ah, La Vendée, a wonder tale. Anyway, uh, boy, that
Before we
is
get too
that is
far in,
curious, Prince of Parma. I'm kind of inclined to get it just because I wonder how they deal with it. With the stuff. I'm sorry. Once you get through the stream today, I think you will also think back to this super chat and go, "How did you make a child's book out of this?"
yeah, how many? I would love to see their uptick in sales just out of morbid curiosity from the purchasers. Um,
Right.
Before we get too far in, it might be worth noting we might be one short from what was advertised.
Yeah, I don't know. Panama Hat is meant to join with us, but he is traveling. So he said start without him. He'll join when he can. So I'm assuming he's joining. Everything's ready to go for him to join. Also, something else to note is Apostolic Majesty has a series. What's the best way for me to share that with you all? I think it is to share his series of tweets where he kindly mentioned this as part of that series. Here we go. He has a great trailer, by the way. I said this was spontaneous, and I'm pretty sure it was, but I remember I did watch his trailer. Anyway, this is a Twitter thread that I just shared in the live chat. that points to a lecture he just did right before this on the French Revolution. Tomorrow he'll be doing the Terror, and overlapping a little bit with our topic here, but we're keeping a very narrow focus today relative to what he's doing. And then actually, in part 3 will be on Saturday, and I should look at the tweet to tell you what that covers. I think it's basically getting into the Napoleon. Let's see. Yeah, Napoleonic France will be part 3 on Saturday. So it's French Revolution days here in our sphere somehow. But honestly, I don't think it was because of the seeing the trailer. When I read about the Vendée in I think Francois Furet's French book on the French Revolution, which I'm holding up, the French Revolution 1770 to 1814. I was really struck by his recounting, really very briefly compared to what we're going to do today, his recounting of what happened. So, I didn't warn you of this, Ryan, but I want to keep the focus fairly narrow. There's a little bit of context we'll provide because otherwise you can't understand at all what's going on. But basically, I'm going to take it as read that you've gone off and you've watched Apostolic Majesty, or you just know something about the French Revolution, and that the events of the French Revolution began in 1789. We will do a little backfill, or you just won't understand what's happening. But I'm just going to say that the revolution begins in 1789, but our story is going to begin in 1793 with a little a little flashback about the civil constitution of the clergy, which is absolutely critical to this tale. Sound reasonable, Ryan? And
yes, that sounds wonderful.
In particular, part of the reason I'm doing that is because I don't want to take the perspective of the revolutionaries. I'm trying as much as possible today to tell the story from the perspective of the people in the Vendée. You know, what happened to them, why they did what they did, right? As opposed to, you know, like in Furet, he's talking a lot about sort of how the French Revolution had to view them in the context of how it was seeing things. I kind of don't care. Those people are nuts, as you'll see, and I'm not so interested in their perspective. I'm interested more in the perspective of the people who became the victims of the French Revolution. Seem reasonable, Ryan?
Yes, that sounds wonderful to me.
Yeah, because you know we're not their friends, the French Revolution guys, right? So they have plenty of friends to speak on their behalf, and that's all you get generally. So I want to give a different perspective.
Yeah, I think it would be fair to say that in fact we are polar opposites from them, and very enemies, very much enemies.
Yeah, I guess I'm kind of referencing it, but I should just say on the historiography before we get into the story itself, and the article we'll focus on here starts with that. I'm going to skip over it a bit, but just very briefly, in the marketing I talked about this sort of being a hidden genocide or a hidden aspect of the French Revolution. The French historians, I don't know how to put it. They have their own boomer truth, so to speak, right? They have their own narrative that they have to uphold, and praising the French Revolution, you know, being critical in certain ways, but overall praising it, it seems to be the default mode in France. And the problem with the tale we're going to tell today is that there's just no way to tell this tale honestly and have the French Revolution come out looking nice.
Yep.
Right.
And that's going to happen with a few other things that we would presumably cover as well. Typically, a lot of these left-wing movements are accompanied by extreme left-wing violence. They make the history books the movements do, not necessarily the violence. The movements, are always taken to be very, very positive with only a few unfortunate incidents. And this is one of them. If you read any history book at any point in time, be it one focused on American history, European history, world history, the vast majority of them will say the French Revolution was, by and large, a good thing. It did these great things and have these unfortunate consequences. Or you'll even get the even farther left ones. They'll say the French Revolution was bad because it didn't go far enough. You will never hear about what we're about to talk about in great depth because It just completely shows how wrong and terrible and evil they were.
Yeah, you're right, and that is what I see in the article we're going to look at in Furet. Um, they're basically dealing with the fact that the whole framing is against an honest assessment of what happened. The part that we're about to tell. The framing is always from the perspective of the revolutionaries and from the perspective of them having wonderful ideals and so forth. But as I've argued on the Substack against egalitarianism, wait, did I publish that yet? Anyway, as I either argued or will argue, um, uh, I don't accept that their ideals were, um, beautiful. And, they made the occasional error, but otherwise, let's keep in mind that they were fighting for humanity or something like that. I reject this framing altogether. I think their ideals were satanic, frankly. And so I think that rather than this being like a fly in the ointment, right? That's what Ryan was just saying. They'll maybe mention some of these sorts of things, but they'll be like, certain excesses happened. Things got a little out of control. There was an understandable reaction when certain people, were not going along with progress, or it's always done in this sort of defensive apologetic mode. Rather than framing it that way, I would say that what we're going to see here shows us the true face, like the picture of Dorian Gray, right? This is the true face of the revolution that we're going to look at today, I think.
Right.
And the rest of it I dismiss as rationalization, window dressing, rhetoric. This is the heart of it. This is where it shows its soul, Okay.
Right.
So go ahead.
I would say one last thing. If we end up covering the Spanish left and their civil war and the atrocities that they will carry out against the very same church, this will look very familiar. It almost might even be a foreshadowing. So just take in
Absolutely.
everything that we're about to tell you, because it will come up again, and not just in that circumstance, but hundreds of others.
Oh, I was thinking of the Bolsheviks as I read about this as well.
Yeah.
In particular, the very early part of, them taking over and the terror that they imposed. So yeah. This gets echoed from here on for the next couple hundred years after this. Okay. Hopefully from our tone, everyone knows what they're in for, and no one comes back to me later and says, wow, I didn't know you were going to talk about really horrible things. We're going to talk about really horrible things. I'm just going to be really upfront and honest with you about that. Okay? This is nightmare material, folks. Here we go. Okay. Our story begins on January 21st, 1793, with the execution of Louis XVI. Now, Furet is at pains to emphasize that these regions, the Vendée being our focus here, Vendée, did not rise up when the king was beheaded. Okay. Later on, they make these banners they fight under that say God and King, but this should not be understood as, Louis XVI is executed and then the Vendée rises. That's not the sequence of events. Here is the reason why the story begins here. With Louis XVI executed, this radicalized the conflict so that by the spring of 1793, within a month or two of this happening, you had entry into the war against the French Revolution of Britain, the Pope, Spain, and German and Italian princes. Okay, so the volume is turned up on the war, and that's where the Vendée comes in. I'm sorry, I looked up the pronunciation. I keep on messing it up. It's like Vendée or something. Anyway, I can't do French. Vendée. Oh, Vendée. That's it. Vendée. The revolt in the Vendée began as a rejection of conscription. But there's one other aspect to it. Okay, so let's look at the article here. I can get to it. This article is, believe it or not, in Quillette, but credit where it's due. This is an excellent article, drawing from a source that I didn't even know existed. The last time I studied the French Revolution, this crucial source hadn't been published yet, and I would love to get my hands on it, but unfortunately it seems like it's only in French. This is called The French Genocide That Has Been Airbrushed from History by Jasprit Singh Boparai. And here's the story. Renaud Secher, Sechet, I don't know how to say these French names, in 2011 discovered documents in the National Archives in Paris confirming what he had known since the early 80s. There had been a genocide during the French Revolution. And he published his initial findings in Le Genocide Franco-Français. What does that mean? The genocide of the French? I don't know how to translate that.
I wouldn't be able to tell you.
Yeah. Anyway, a version of his doctoral dissertation he had published in '86, and then he continued to find more info, as we just explained. So skipping over the traditional historiography, I already told you what's going on there. Blah, blah, blah. Don't care about those people. Sorry. Let me get to where I want to get to. Oh, he does mention here Francois Furet, who I also just mentioned, the ex-communist historian, who I think is a pretty good source in his book, The French Revolution, and Interpretations of the French Revolution is another good book. Okay, so the Vendée is in the west of France. It's on the west coast. It's kind of in the middle of the west coast of France. And they became renowned for their piety after Protestants were driven out in 1685. So this is a counter-Reformation. It's a strongly counter-Reformation area. And by the time you get to this period, 100 years later or whatever, they are, 100 years later from this in particular, but there was things that happened here before that. They have very strong relationship with a priesthood, which there's a lot of priests basically in the Vendée, and there's a lot of regular worship. So it's a highly religious area, but it's considered politically and economically kind of a backwater. As I read this, Ryan, I kept thinking of Hillary Clinton, right, calling people deplorables.
Right.
And Obama talking about people with their guns and Bibles. I kept thinking that, this is what they'd like to do to us,
Yes,
Anyway.
and my mind went to a very similar direction. This could be a very equivalent to how popular media now views the American South, very heavily Protestant because it's the United States. But it's the backwater, it's the rural backwater, right, where no one is well off. Everyone's just struggling down there in their backwards religious state.
Yeah.
That was the analogy that my mind drew.
Yeah, it's curious. Evidently, if someone is backwards, it seems like that results in the mind of progressives in a license to kill. Don't exactly know how that follows, right? Because you'd think that one response to someone being backward would be maybe, that you'd want to help them, right? But it seems like when a progressive calls you backward, be careful because they might come gunning for you soon,
Right, and there's a lot of overlap between those two choices that you just threw out there, because there are some progressives where in their very genocidal outlooks towards these backwards religious people, it usually originally started with, we have to get them into the modern era, and then whenever that region inevitably resists their graceful olive branch being extended towards them, then it becomes we have to help them by getting rid of them because they don't know what's good for them and their backward ways are harming them. Therefore, we have to completely destroy their ways of lives, their leaders, and all of their hierarchical cultures. That's typically how I see it displayed.
I'm reminded of a piece by Isabel Patterson called The Humanitarian with the Guillotine, which nicely brings together those two elements, right? Compassion and killing, which you would think wouldn't go together, but there you go. Okay, so another thing you need to know geographically is that the closest major city is Nantes. It's spelled Nantes, but it's pronounced Nantes. And it's going to be critical in here as another area that comes under fire because of resistance. Okay, so one thing to understand is, first of all, that the Vendéans that they welcomed the French Revolution, at least initially. So these were not hardcore, I guess left wingers would call them reactionaries. I mean, I don't accept that framing, but you follow me.
Revolutionaries.
Yeah. They were not like from the beginning, we're going to stop this thing, There were high levels of taxation. It says even the pious were fed up with what they had to pay to the church, and it sort of explains, that wasn't, they liked their local priest, but there was sort of another apparatus which was sort of taxing them to death. They got along with their local nobility, but they were not happy with basically the central government. So from that point of view, the fall of the ancient regime for them looked like potentially they were going to get a break, get a break from high taxation and sort of oppression, right? So they were not immediately against this. And Furet has a great line. I don't want to miss saying this. He says, "It was not the fall of the ancient regime which roused the populace against the revolution, but the setting up of a new one." Okay, now I think we're going to have to get to our little flashback to the earlier part of the French Revolution prior to 1793 to give context. And that is that pretty quickly, in 1789, pretty quickly the revolution starts seizing church property. Okay. And then they pass something called the Civil Constitution of the Clergy. And this is just something you have to understand this story. It completely subordinated the church to the revolutionary government. It forbade Catholic allegiance to any foreign authority. Now, why would that be such a problem? Well, the Pope, from this point of view, is a foreign authority. So, if you know anything about Catholic beliefs, then you might understand why this is a bit of a problem for the French government to say, sorry, guys, you can't be loyal to the Pope.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's not necessarily that they are, it's not a neutral decree. It is specifically attacking the Roman Catholic hierarchy.
Right.
This is to say, for instance, if France was not Roman Catholic at this time and they still had similar elements imposing their laws, you would not see the exact same law here. It's not that the French revolutionaries were just ardent nationalists who wanted to make sure all churches were aligned with their people.
Right.
It's more that they were very much against the Roman Catholic Church in France. And so, how do you weaken it? Well, you completely destroy whatever is at the top of that hierarchy, like you would any other organization.
Right. So this is a takeover of hierarchy. I think Ryan's framing it really well, right? Because the article goes on to say there would be no more recognizing the authority of bishops who had been appointed by non-French powers. Okay, so that means basically we're cutting the head off, right? The Pope, and not just the head, but the bishops, or the bishops that aren't under our sway. We're cutting the top of the hierarchy off, and we're putting ourselves on top instead. So this seems much more akin in a way. Tell me if this is a bad historical analogy, Ryan, but it makes me think a little bit more of, I think Peter in Russia taking over headship of the church, and perhaps Henry VIII taking over headship of the Church of England. Am I being unfair? You see why I think of it as being analogous.
Yeah.
Right?
There's similarities, and I'm sure that a lot more of the ardent Roman Catholic viewership of ours would agree fervently, especially the Henry VIII analogy, because Henry VIII also accompanied with a few persecutions and dissolution of the monasteries, things like that, with church property.
Good point.
But there is one very large difference in that in both of those examples, they would still retain the clergy from the previous, just so long as they
Right.
adopted the new confession of faith, they kept their position basically. It wasn't
Right.
seen as some terrible thing that they came from the last regime. They didn't completely change the guard or demand fealty
On the
necessarily.
right with the lower parts of the hierarchy. Right.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. But with the French Revolution, they're more thoroughgoing. So all the clergy, meaning your local parish priest, had to swear allegiance to the revolutionaries. So they were now to be made civil servants, completely subject to the French state. Now, by the way, in I think the talk on medieval anarchism, I really emphasized the significance of um, the church and Christianity being separate from the civil governments, right? This is the true original separation between church and state, not the left liberal American version. This was where power was divided in Europe, not only as we emphasized in the episode on medieval anarchism, not only in the sense of decentralization, political decentralization, but the secular and the religious authorities were not the same, right? So you didn't have like the Egyptian pharaoh god. You had, the king, but he could be checked to some degree by, the bishops or the religious authorities who could say, whoa, you're going too far, right? And then the people would be like, the bishops just said you shouldn't do that. King might do it anyway, but there was something external to the secular hierarchy that could act as a check, right?
Right. This is to say that the nobility, the secular authorities, the king, the dukes, the nobles, the barons, they all had their responsibilities that were unique to them. And so did the church, the bishops, the priests, the archbishops. They all had their responsibilities that were unique to them and not shared by the secular authorities.
Right.
And they could both check each other. So the secular authorities were often coronated by the church, and the church had oversight over them. And then the secular authorities, as well, in keeping with good governance, often had a very large role in making sure that their you know, locality didn't turn away from the faith. So you had them checking each other basically, but they weren't. They didn't amalgamate into one office.
Right. Right. And so the French Revolution, from this point of view, is, well, being really revolutionary, right? This is an ancient order of Europe that's been going on for well over 1,000 years, that division between secular and religious authority. And they're striking right at the heart of it, saying, Pope's out of the picture, Bishop's not loyal to us, they're out of the picture, and every one of you is going to be under the state, swearing allegiance to us, following our orders. So this now would then, if they were successful, and we'll see that they actually aren't, if this were successful, then it would collapse those two contending authorities, secular and religious, into one secular/religious authority, right? Okay,
Right.
so what actually happened though? So that's what they wanted, but here's what happened. Most priests and bishops condemned the civil constitution of the clergy, refused to swear the oath that would subject them to civil authorities, very correctly, in my view. And so the revolutionary authorities were concerned that people were still loyal to the clergy rather than them. As AA has emphasized in his work on elite theory, power has a sort of a hunger to consolidate and have nothing disloyal to itself. It's a jealous God, right? Power. So let's see. Okay, most priests remain disobedient. So then he gives us a little more background on what happened leading up to this. In November 1790, 103 priests from Nantes, notice that this is the city near the Vendée, 103 priests deliver a letter of protest on this. And the Bishop of Nantes ordered his clergy to reject the civil constitution, and 9 out of 10 of them did anyway. So they were actually, the clergy was actually pretty mostly united in saying we're not going to do this. So the revolutionary authorities appointed new bishops from those few priests who had decided to be subservient. Now here's a term you're going to have to know. So in 1791, refractory clergy, which is their term for clergy who won't go with this new order and swear the oath. It says they decided, the revolutionary government decided that they could deport or exile refractory clergy. Only obedient constitutional clergy then are loyal to the new revolutionary constitution of France or whatever, right? Only the constitutional clergy who had pledged their allegiance were allowed to carry out duties, and so most priests were not going for this, right? Well, what happened? Now you had a shortage of priests that were legally allowed to practice. So most parishes now had no one to carry out baptisms, weddings, funerals. Churches were locked up, and this is sort of moving in my view. Citizens continued to show up to church on Sundays, even when the doors were sealed and the priest was imprisoned or in hiding. So this was not going over well, to put it bluntly. The people refused to show up to masses celebrated by constitutional priests, and the constitutional clergy were ridiculed as cowards, traitors, and infidels, and they were subject to physical assault. They'd be attacked.
Right. So I don't want to go too far into a tangent, but
Yeah.
this happened before in the early church under the persecutions, where the Roman authorities declared that the Christian priesthood had to hand over all of their religious writings as part of the persecutions, and those that did became known as traditores, people that would hand over or trade in their works, and the ones that didn't would be the Orthodox clergy, basically. I forget. I think there was a name for them, but I forget what it was. This isn't the first time that a secular authority has done something like this, and a split has occurred, where the compliant clergy were extremely unpopular and seen to be very sinful, and the resisting clergy were seen to be the actual church. Except this has only really happened maybe once before, and it was over 1,000 years ago at this point.
Right.
This has happened before. The split did happen. Resulted in a sect or a heresy known as Donatism, which has been mentioned in a couple other streams before in these spheres. But this is a pretty bad thing if you can see the results from the early church. They are literally splitting the church in half at this point, and
Right.
that's terrible for a layman.
Yeah. And this is why it's so important to remember these incidents that kind of get buried, get thrown down the Orwellian memory hole because they don't fit with the progressive arc of history that we're sold, because you need to remember what it looks like when subversion comes, and remember the heroes who resisted it, right? So it says these constitutional priests were public officials now, and they could be protected by armed forces, particularly when the faithful showered them with dirt, manure, and rocks, or kicked them and spat in their faces. So, yeah. So anyway, this is already happening, like a year or two before the events we're talking about here. Let's see. Yeah, they wanted priests who would obey them, follow orders, not talk back. And the clergy stood in the way. Okay, I didn't mention this yet. The clergy stood in the way of their plans to conscript 300,000 men for the Revolutionary Army. So, back to our story, our 1793 timeline. King Louis XVI is executed in January 1793. We have all these people enter the war, and the revolutionary government decides they need to conscript 300,000 men, and they start drawing from using random lots or something. I don't know, something like that. They start trying to draw from all over the country. So now the timeline gets really tight. March 6th, 1793, All Catholic churches not served by constitutional clergy are permanently closed. Okay. Then the next day, on March 7th, a recruitment law went into effect. I missed this when I was first reading over this article. Revolutionary leaders, legislators, municipal authorities, administrators, and government functionaries in general were, of course, exempt from military service. Anyway, okay.
Right. So what's happened is the revolutionary government has completely destroyed the Roman Catholic Church, and in this region, anyways, completely severing it from its hierarchy. And now they are conscripting what would previously have been the Roman Catholic faithful, that
Right.
would have been in opposition to them. Their leadership is gone. They are mostly scattered as a result, as you might be able to gather from just how people organize. And most faithful Roman Catholics, as you could probably deduce from this, would be in opposition to fighting for the government that just dissolved their church, basically.
Well, there's some great quotes here.
Yeah.
Here we go. So let's see. So they come to do the conscription decree, and this district commissioner comes to give this decree about conscription. He was met with 40 peasants armed with sticks who chanted, "Holy freedom, sacred freedom," and one of them shouted, "You have killed our king, you have chased away our priests, and you have sold off the property of our church. Where's the money? You've spent it all. Now you want our bodies? No, you will not have them." Other peasants asked, "What, you expect us to go fight for this government? To go fight at the command of men who have turned the administration of this country upside down, executed our king, sold all the church's land, and want to subject us to priests we do not want, whilst they send the real leaders of our church to prison?" So this is like, they've lost the loyalty of the people here, I think is what they're trying to say. So what happens? It begins on March 10th, 1793. So remember, March 6th, they closed down any churches, all churches not served by constitutional clergy. March 7th, the recruitment law goes into effect. March 10th, the kickback comes. It begins in the Vendée with coordinated attacks across the countryside, mainly on officers of the National Guard who were stationed outside the official churches, the constitutional churches, right, that had constitutional clergy. So hopefully you can see this is a reaction to conscription, and it's a reaction to religious oppression, I guess, all mixed up together. I don't think you could disentangle those two things. It's all happening at the same time, and they're reacting to both simultaneously, right?
Yes, agree.
Okay, so riots erupted in the towns. The roaming mobs began to ransack revolutionary officers, and they're not very organized. They've got hoes, they've got pitchforks. Is this the section that he titled? Where is it? No. Anyway, the next section he titles it. It is literally like, the pitchfork mob. Mayors and constitutional clergy were physically attacked. Municipal administration buildings were burnt to the ground, and officials and revolutionary patriots, patriotic to the revolutionary government, were forced to flee. And so the revolutionary officials in Paris had to pay attention. Okay, here we go. This is the title I wanted to share. Hillbillies with Pitchforks. So what you find here in this account is that this is, how do we put this? It suffers the defect that academic agent has been teaching about, right? A populist uprising that isn't particularly well organized. They're not well armed, and so it doesn't really work out that well in the end, right? Having said that, having acknowledged that reality, it's amazing how much they do, given their limited martial abilities and means, limited weapons, and limited organization. So the rebels' volunteer army numbered between 25 and 40,000 peasants, and I like this, whose main fighting experience consisted of drunken brawls in village taverns. um, so this is the what is it in the British context? We would say this is the rise of the gammon or something, right? This is the rise of the rednecks, to use the American term.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's exactly what that's who you should be picturing, the kind of folks here, right? Country folks, rough folks, but not trained, right? So they had no uniforms, they're wearing wooden clogs instead of boots. Yet they consistently managed to beat back well-armed, experienced professional soldiers. They were mostly armed. There were some hunting rifles, but they were mostly armed with pitchforks, shovels, and hoes. I mean, just imagine. And they're fighting troops that are all have guns, So the revolutionary generals were surprised that they were fighting so fiercely. Let's see. Under the circumstances, the discipline of the rebels was outstanding, and the revolutionary generals admitted this. So they were not happy about this, and they began to describe them as brigands. And what that means is, now that they're brigands, they can be treated like criminals. So here's a constitutional priest, someone aligned with the regime, on May 7th, 1793. So this is just 2 months into this, right? March 10th, it really begins in earnest. He says to them, the sons of the Charente region await your orders to exterminate these brigands who are tearing apart our beloved nation. You citizens stand firm at your post. Do not lose sight of the traitors and conspirators. Never forget that if you show mercy, you will be feeding vampires and vultures within the precincts of this city, and one day they will drink deeply of the blood of those who saved them from the vengeance that their crimes deserve. And so in April 1793, they began to round up suspected brigands and execute them without trial. So this is the beginning of the serious killing. Go ahead.
Before we move on,
Yeah.
there were a few things that we skipped over from the last thing that I thought really painted the picture for people, just to know what was going on, just to show just how unorganized or populistic this rising was and how grim it was. We have right here I believe this would be the second paragraph under hillbillies with pitchforks.
Mm-hmm.
We have the second sentence of the second paragraph. Of course, the rebels had no reinforcements behind them, and they knew that if they did not repel the revolutionaries, their homes would be destroyed and their families butchered. The Vendeans were not paid for their fighting. Their main rewards for winning a battle was not being slaughtered for a little while longer. So that's the outlook here.
Yeah. Not very hopeful, unfortunately. Okay, so they start executing people, but on April 11th, one general says to another, a man's death is soon forgotten while the memory of burning down his house lasts for years. So it says they usually ensured that there was nobody at home, but they started burning down the houses of anyone who was involved with this. And they also started firing cannons at churches. Now, I highlight this because from a certain point of view, why do they bother wasting valuable cannonballs and military maneuvers on churches, right? I don't know, maybe they're breaking into the broken churches and using them as military centers, but I saw no mention of that. In my mind, the better way to understand this is the theme that we will see throughout this series, which is that left-wing terror targeted Christians, targeted churches, church bells, monks, nuns. We'll see this in the early Soviet Union. We'll see it in the Spanish Civil War. and we see it here in the French Revolution. This is a theme you're going to see, and I think there's better explanations than military tactics, shall we say.
Right, and just to kind of further underscore the point of why they would be firing munitions into churches, uh, think about the average Roman Catholic church that you would see in rural France at this time, or in some of the larger cities over there, the more traditional areas. You know, there would be statues, stained glass. You would have there would be multiple decorations. Uh, Icons is what the iconoclasts would call them, but they would definitely adorn the churches. So if you completely tear them down and destroy them wantonly without discrimination, by like say from a cannon, you completely destroy the art and the expression of these people for their faith. It's gone. You
Right.
know, if you blast a cannon or a stained glass window with a cannonball, you know, it's gone. You can get a
Yeah.
new one. You can try to recreate it, but the old one has been destroyed.
Sorry, I just wanted to see if Panama Hat's going to get to join us. Okay, yeah, so they established foundries for cannons in friendly territory. There were many churches throughout the Vendée that they had not yet fired upon. They started confiscating metal, anything that could be used as a weapon, even a fork. This is sounding like the TSA, Ryan, you know? Um,
Yeah,
taking your nail file because it could be used as a weapon, you know? Anyway,
or the British government. Yeah, with their
right, yeah.
quite famously joked about for their stringent enforcement of any potential weapons.
Um, and then they confiscated church bells wherever they could. This is something I remember from the Bolsheviks. They were always grabbing church bells. Not only to be melted down for cannonballs, but because they thought they were being used for signaling. And then they established spying. Okay, so by the end of June 1793, the revolutionary armies were struggling to maintain order. Their men were refusing to fire on the brigands. Some were deserting their posts and abandoning the cause of capital P progress.
Uh, I meant to interject before we moved
Oh,
off the church bell thing as well.
oh yeah.
But remember, this is the this is the era before alarm clocks. How does someone know if they're like out in the fields, out about walking? You're a peasant. You don't have all these fancy clocks and pocket watches to keep with you. How do you know the church services are being held?
Mm-hmm.
It's the church bells ringing.
Right.
So they have the strategic and utilitarian purposes of confiscating them that you mentioned, but it also makes sure that they're completely unorganized. If ever they were to gather there, the church bells are gone.
Right.
That was their main signal that like matins or morning prayers or anything like that was going to be held. It's
Right.
gone. They completely disorganized them.
Right. Destroy the rhythm of religious life, basically. Um, okay, so what happens next? Oh yeah, so the revolutionary armies are losing men who are deserting and refusing orders and so forth. To basically destroy these people, these country people. But the revolution could replace them. So another 20,000 battle-hardened soldiers were dispatched to the Vendée. And General Solomon in June 1793 tells them this is a war of brigands. It calls for all of us to become brigands. At this point, we have to forget all military regulations, fall en masse on these criminals, and hound them relentlessly. The revolution is going to more and more merciless tactics. They had already begun to destroy windmills and bell towers. Windmills, if you ever see the old episode we did on the Industrial Revolution of the Middle Ages, windmills are really key for the productivity of agriculture and so forth. It's used to grind grain and things like that. So destroying a windmill is really destroying the ability of people to be productive and feed
Right, so destroying the
themselves.
food supply in particular.
Yeah, yeah, attacking the food supplies. So they'd been doing that, but now they start systematically demolishing houses and chateaux. So then, So they outnumber the brigands because they just keep pouring more soldiers into this relatively small region. If you look at a map of the Vendée compared to the rest of France, it's really small. Um, all of it can't withstand all of France against it, right? Which isn't quite fair, by the way. We're focusing on the Vendée, but there's some surrounding areas that are with them on this. But it's roughly that area, but a small area relative to France. So as you get into the summer of 1793, the Revolutionary Army starts to regain territory and drive the brigands back, and now the killing really begins. The revolutionaries preferred not to take prisoners. There was going to be no clemency or mercy. Um, so, and here comes the most brutal part. The Committee for Public Safety sent Jean-Baptiste Carrier to Nantes. He arrived on October 20th, 1793, and stayed there until the middle of February. So we get into winter here. And they send this guy. He pioneered the technique of drowning brigands to save money on bullets. During his 4 months there, 452 alleged brigands were acquitted and released. Almost 2,000 were executed by normal means. 3,000 or so died of disease, and almost 5,000 were drowned. At first, they used drowning for the refractory clergy, the clergy who wouldn't sign up to be part of this new, disloyal church, or loyal to the regime church. So on November 1793, 80 priests were drowned together in a boat. In December, a further 58 were drowned. And then 10 days later, they started drowning brigands in general, not just priests. 129 Vendéans were drowned. It became customary to drown. I gotta wait till my child's out. Okay, you gotta go, dear. Come on. Sorry, I just realized what I was about to read while my 7-year-old was in the room. Come on, dear. Okay. It became customary to drown brigands naked, not merely so that the revolutionaries could help themselves to the Vendéans' clothes, but also so that the younger women among them could be raped before death. So drowning spread far beyond Nantes, the big city near the Vendée. On December 16th, General Marceau sent a letter to the Ministry of War announcing, among other victories, that at least 3,000 non-combatant Vendéan women had been drowned. The revolutionaries were drunk with blood and could not slaughter their brigand prisoners fast enough. Women, children, old people, priests, the sick, the infirm. If the prisoners could not walk fast enough to the killing grounds, they were bayoneted in the stomach and left on the ground to be trampled by other prisoners as they bled to death. General Westermann said that he arrived at Laval on December 14th with his cavalry to see piles of cadavers, thousands of them, heaped up on either side of the road. The bodies were not counted, they were simply dumped after the soldiers stripped their clothes off. No brigand was allowed to return home. Westermann and his men slaughtered every brigand they could find until the roads of the area were littered with corpses. Talks about 400 Vendéans in one day in December 29th. And then his single finest day of slaughter was on December 21st, as he announced to an appreciative and grateful Committee for Public Safety, "Citizens of the Republic, there is no more Vendée. She has died beneath our saber of freedom, with her women and children. I have buried her in the woods and marshes of Savonne. Following your orders, I have crushed her children under the hooves of my horses and massacred her women, who will give birth to no further brigands now. There is not a single prisoner who could criticize my actions. I have exterminated them all." So 3,000 brigands were killed, and another 4,000 taken prisoner and were shot later.
Right, and notice the rhetoric that he was using there. The saber of freedom.
I
We
know.
have being delivered to the Committee for Public Safety. We've got there's some stuff that you would still see today, mind you. I have absolutely no doubt that any of our Western governments, should they keep drifting along the path that they are on, probably found a committee for public safety or committee for tolerance or something like that, and start
Yep.
drowning any clergymen or resistors that they could find. This is I think particularly interesting to us because you wouldn't find this necessarily before now. A committee for public safety and a saber of freedom going in and completely exterminating an entire part of the nation. Uh, this is a I think this is something that's definitely carried over into the modern day. That's worth noting. A reflection point. Sorry.
Absolutely. I mean, I you can never say like we'd never seen anything like this before, but on this kind of scale, I would say that um, there was something new about this revolutionary violence, right? And this revolutionary terror, this targeting of civilians of women, of priests. So he says now they're making headway against the combatants, and so the ones who are out there fighting, and they decide to end the lives of Vendéans who had stayed home during the rebellion or had somehow managed to get back home. So as early as December 20th, 1793, the soldiers are combing the countryside in search of candidates for extrajudicial executions. Some of them compared the process to hunting rabbits. None of the prey was armed. Um, so
I
now
mean,
go ahead.
there's the part after that that just paints it even more grim. If I could read that.
Well, wait, are you getting into the Crusade for Liberty?
No. The
Oh,
the
okay,
last
go ahead.
sentence of that
Oh, go
paragraph.
ahead, read it. Yeah.
It's written they were never guillotined because these were mere peasants and artisans. There were very few onlookers who would be particularly interested in watching them die.
Right.
I don't think that needs comment.
Ordinary people. Yeah. So now the Crusade for Liberty. You already hinted at it with the rhetoric before. Well, now they really go into overdrive. Um, so the Vendéan Department of the Revolutionary Government, it issued a proclamation in year 2 of the revolution, in case you didn't know that they decided to start the numbering over. I actually had a replica pack of cards from year 1 or year 2 of the French Revolution. December 2nd, 1793, promising peace and security to the citizens of the region. It is time for the French to come together as one and the same family. Your people have disappeared. Commerce has been annihilated. Farming has withered away thanks to this disastrous war. Blah, blah, blah. Everybody lay down their arms. It is decreed by law that all the people known as rebels in the Vendée who lay down their arms within a month of the decree will neither be sought out nor bothered just because they rebelled. This law is not a fake amnesty. We come in the name of the National Convention. Blah, blah, blah. Let us embrace like brothers. And now comes the voiceover. In fact, it was a fake amnesty. So on January 17th, 1794, General Turreau set out with 2 armies of 6 divisions on a crusade of liberty to deal with what remained of the brigands. He ordered his lieutenants to spare nobody. Women and children were also to be bayoneted in the stomach if there was the slightest hint of suspicion. Houses, farms, villages, and thickets were all to be set on fire. Anything that could burn would have to burn. And now we get our title, suggested by Panama Hat, the columns of hell, or the infernal columns. Soldiers in the infernal columns of the crusade had explicit instructions to wipe out every last possible trace of resistance or rebellion. Crusaders for liberty were relatively sparing in their use of the bayonet. Men, women, and children were more often shot or burned alive in their houses. Babies were not spared, nor were toddlers or small children. The usual practice was to kill babies in front of their mothers, then kill the mothers. Young girls were often drowned after first being raped. Widows were usually beaten, insulted, and drowned. This is a theme that struck me as I've been learning over decades about left-wing terror. It's not just these people are in our way. They're in the way of progress or whatever. And so, unfortunately, we have to eliminate them. And let's just, we're humanitarian. They're humanitarians, right? They're crusaders for freedom. So, let's eliminate them in the most, humanitarian way possible. It's a shame, but we've got to do it. No, no, no. What I see again and again in left-wing terror is sadism, torture, cruelty, killing a baby in front of the mother, right? That speaks of wanting to inflict, mental anguish, to say the least. The black masses we've already referred to. We'll see more of that in later episodes. That is causing people to do things that are profane, that violate their most sacred, the things that they hold most holy and sacred. This is a theme we see through this. So I hope you're not offended that I use words like satanic and demonic. This is why, because it goes beyond just, a utilitarian, we're taking over. Sorry, we got to get rid of you guys. You're in our way. You're resisting. No, it goes beyond that. There's something else going on here, in my view.
Right, yeah, and if you want to really buttress that point, read the next paragraph.
Right. So not all brigand corpses were dumped or left in the ruins of their homes. Many bodies were skinned for their leather. Now, AA was just telling me that people wouldn't do crazy practices like this, Ryan. He couldn't believe such a thing.
Yeah.
But here it
this
is.
This is something else I've come across in other instances of revolution. Usually, is the more zealous side will just skin people dead, skin people that are dead. I haven't come across yet an instance of people being skinned alive, but it wouldn't surprise me if it's out there, because we have examples like this where they will just go through the dead laying on the fields and skin their bodies for leather, human leather. So particularly shocking to me anyways. That's why I thought it would emphasize your point that this is very satanic.
Yeah. I appreciate Lady of Shalot's comment, Ryan. She says, "Dear God, this is awful. Why do so few people know about this?" That is a question worth asking. Why do so few people know about this? Anyway, never mind that. The purpose here is to remember those things that they would rather that we forget. On April 5th, 1794, General Cruzat's soldiers burned 150 women alive to extract their fat to use as grease. As many as 62,000 soldiers took part in these columns of hell.
Yeah, fat extracted from humans.
Right.
For grease.
Yeah. So the killing became at such a large scale that they actually had to start cleaning it up, because it was gonna make the soldiers sick. So they had to start burying the bodies who had not been drowned. Listen to the brutality. There are still 20,000 unslit throats in this miserable province, says one of the bureaucrats. Eventually, the killing ended. On February 17th, 1795, what was left of the brigands' leadership signed a peace treaty with the revolutionary government, which generously allowed Vendéans who had been rendered destitute by the destruction of their property and livelihoods to join the Revolutionary Army. So after all that, the surviving ones got conscripted anyway. But the Brigands' Rebellion never really ended, and they were occasionally compelled to take further action, as in April 1795, when besieged rebels were burned alive in their church. And it says at least their freedom of religion had been officially restored. And I don't know what happened in January 1795, but maybe it allowed for the churches to reopen. That
the typical historiography with this is that the French Revolution initially was extremely anti-clerical, and then as it went on, it continued to let up until you eventually see Napoleon Bonaparte converting to Roman Catholicism and trying to restore the holdings of the church in the country. I don't know particularly what happened on January 21st, 1795. I don't
Yeah, I
have
can't
dates
find it.
memorized to that precision, but it was probably the repeal of some decree
Yeah,
to do with the closing of the churches in the province, if I had to hazard a guess.
they probably eased
Uh,
off in some fashion. Yeah.
right. So this is that's my comment on that, the historiography.
Right. Okay. So conclusions about this very dark episode. Um, so Reynald Secher, or Secher probably, who did this research and dug into the National Archives, he estimates that just over 117,000 Vendéans disappeared as a result of the Brigands' Rebellion, out of a population of just over 815,000. This amounts to roughly 1 in 7 Vendéans fatally affected by military actions in the Crusade for Liberty. Now, those of you who already know something about communist crimes in the 20th century may not be quite as shocked by this, but remember that this is well before the horrors of Stalinism and Pol Pot, and it's on a proportional scale that is pretty staggering. 1 out of every 7. It might only be, I would have to check my stats, but it might only be Pol Pot in Cambodia that went beyond that to the horrifying 1 out of 4, 1 out of 3, or whatever that died under the Cambodian communists. But this is much later, right? This is just shocking. Some areas, so that's in general over the whole region, 1 out of 7. But some areas it was much worse. Some areas lost half their population or more, with notably heavy losses at Collet, which lost 3/5 of its houses as well as 3/5 of its people. So 1 out of 7 is on average, but there's some places where it's over half of the people are slaughtered. Colleges, libraries, schools were destroyed, as well as churches, private houses, farms, workshops, places of business. The Vendée lost 18% of its private houses. A quarter of the communes in Deux-Sèvres saw the destruction of 50% or more of all habitable buildings. And there was a widespread epidemic of venereal disease. I'm assuming from all the, he doesn't spell it out, but I'm assuming from all the rape that we were hearing about. And then this article goes on to call it a genocide, as Secher called it, the French genocide. And I think that's all I wanted to draw from that. Let me know if there's anything else. Oh, he just ends the article by talking about the original, and I don't think I'd heard this. The original motto of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, fraternity, or death. When we think of Patrick Henry saying "Give me liberty or give me death," we don't usually think of it as "Give me liberty or I'll slaughter you and your children and rape your women."
Yeah, getting them, try to get their fat. Yeah, something tells me the American revolutionaries were saying, "I will die for this," whereas the French revolutionaries were saying, "You will die for this."
You will die for this. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what's giving me that impression though.
So I've left the article. We actually have quite a few super chats. Why don't we start working through those, and might get a chance to work in some other comments we have, Ryan. Okay, we already mentioned Prince of Parma, A Tale of the Rising, No Surrender, A Tale of the Rising in La Vendée by J.E. Henty, for a younger audience in a historical novel form. Wow. Maybe I'll ask my daughter to read that one for me and let me know. Mickey, our friend Mickey, says, Radlib, you say you see sadism in the French Revolution. The term sadism literally originates there with the brute Marquis de Sade, who gave it his name. That's correct. And one thing that E. Michael Jones, who isn't always, shall we say, balanced in his historical judgments, Ryan, but his focus on the Marquis de Sade is well placed, I think. Eric von Kunnelt-Ledeen also puts focus on Marquis de Sade in his book on leftism, Leftism Revisited, which is a book maybe, maybe Leftism Revisited is a book for us to do after we go through all this left-wing terror. And then we
It
can
would be
talk about Kunnelt-Ledeen as a capper,
yeah, it could be a nice return. We could do another 3-hour stream.
Um, next one, Narco Republican says the French Revolution seems admirable to those who know it poorly, terrible to those who know it better, grotesque to those who know it best. And he attributes that to NGD, but I'm not sure who that is.
Nicolas Gomez Davila,
Davila. Okay, that's interesting.
the Colombian historian.
In fact, unfortunately, Panama Hat couldn't join us, but we can get one thing from him besides the title of the stream, for which I thank him. He quoted Gomez Davila saying, "The war in the Vendée is the only conflict which arouses my complete sympathy without troubling my reason." I think I know what he means. Ian Sivo says the rationalism and secularism of the revolutionaries was a cover for their actual belief in satanic masonry. Their actions betray their demonism. Yeah, that it's
I was wondering
go
if
ahead.
we'd cover the cult of reason and then the cult of the supreme being, because that seemed right up your alley to cover their sort of complete inversion, not only of secular governance and then also their complete slaughter of people, but also they've tried to found their own religion and spread it among the populace. Like you mentioned, the renumbering of the calendar being a very important religious tool as well as one for secular activities, because the church operates off of a calendar in most of Christianity, where you, I don't know what more to say on that. It's just true. Go look into it
Yeah,
if you don't know
yeah,
anything
right.
about it. So by trying to renumber their calendar, completely renaming the days, completely destroying any orientation that the population might have, as well as we saw earlier, destroying the church bells and destroying time within the day. Uh, we basically see them trying to rewrite religion itself, which all culminates in the cult of the supreme being that came out of the cult of reason. I was wondering if we'd cover that alongside this, but it's not nearly as brutal, and it might detract from the shock value that we laid out
No,
today.
I'm happy to keep it focused here
Yeah,
on the suffering of the Vendée. But I do, since Ian Sivo brought up, satanic masonry and demonism, I do want to reference you to Rothbard's treatment of Karl Marx, which is quite interesting because Rothbard was not religious as far as personally religious. So it's kind of startling, his conclusions on Marx. He first of all, he says the way to understand Marx is not his economics, it's to understand that he was a communist. And he says, now that might sound silly, like Karl Marx was a communist. Yeah, whatever. And he says, no. You have to understand, Karl Marx was a communist as a young man. He started as a communist. That was his commitment from a young age. And later he got into economics and constructed this whole system. But the hardcore devotion was to communism. And then Rothbard goes on to draw from Richard Wurmbrand and his book Marx and Satan, where Wurmbrand dug up the youthful poems of Marx, which are like paeans to Satan. I mean, it's really remarkable stuff. So yeah, it's not crazy. It sounds crazy, right, for people who might have heard of the glorious ideals of the French Revolution and the love of humanity and stuff like that. But the more I learn, the more it seems to me that, as Ian said, this is just a cover for what's really going on, which is an attack on Christians, an attack on hierarchy, as we've highlighted, an attack on the family, all the high-flown ideals, the rhetoric, the idealistic rhetoric. Watch what they do instead of what they say, and I think the satanic inspiration or demonism or whatever you want to call it starts to look pretty plausible if you actually look at their actions.
Right. It reminds me of a certain meme that goes around our spheres that says it's it's not complicated. Your enemies are just satanic pedophiles.
Right, from Aron, I assume.
Right.
Um, okay, Prince of Parma, with a note on that book for the youth. He says, I should state that the book referenced in my first super chat is not intended for young children, perhaps young teens. It is an 1800s reminder of the horrors of the revolution. And then I don't know if I can pull this up quick, but Ian Sivo again. Thanks for all the super chats, folks. Francois de Charette has an amazing quote, too long to share, but it would be great if you would read it. It captures perfectly the difference in values. So wish me luck. I'm going to Google Live here and see if I can find this, and then we'll check for any more. Revolution quotes, maybe.
Yeah, I'm sad that Panama Hat wasn't here to join us because
yeah.
we had two instances of Nicholas Gomez Davila being mentioned.
Yeah, that's his thing.
For anyone in our audience who does not know, he was an extreme reactionary and traditionalist from Colombia, historian, a very ardent Roman Catholic. And one of his things was completely repudiating revolution, which would tie in perfectly to the topic that we are discussing today. I'm not going to speak too much more on it. I don't want to steal Panama Hat's subject. Perhaps he can make his own follow-up to this.
Okay.
Inspired.
I caught all the YouTube super chats and no tips on Subscribestar. Don't forget, if you're a supporter of the show, you can send tips there. I always check for them there, and we get more of the money if you do it that way, and you don't have the length limit on your comments. So supporters have a special back channel through Subscribestar to send lengthier messages. Okay, so I think we've done it all, and I want to leave it there, Ryan. I feel like we've painted the grim picture. I think Lady of Shalott had the right reaction. It's just something you need to know. And that's part of the point of this series. I want to cover a multiplicity of episodes so that we start getting a revision of the history that isn't just intellectual. We start to get a feel for what left-wing terror is like and what it must have felt like for the targets of left-wing terror.
Right. I would hope that skinning corpses for their leather and rendering fat from their bodies would be considered more less academic and more personal than some of the other things that we might discuss.
Yeah. Cringe Walker sends and says just a tip, so he just sent some money in. So thank you, sir, for your support. All right, I think we are done as quick. Well, felt quick to me, but thank you for that. For sticking with this grim subject. It seems clear to me that there's more work to be done. Having said that, Furet, writing before this more recent research we drew on, he says that we don't know as much as we should. These were peasants; they were not writing memoirs. We know what we know mostly because the people who were committing these crimes wrote it down, and it ended up in the French National Archives, and someone finally dug it up. And I think more should be said. It'd be great if Mel Gibson did a movie about the Vendée, or something like that. Someone who could really give it the proper treatment, give it from the perspective of the Vendéans, and just view these French revolutionaries as, beasts and criminals coming into their homes, destroying their traditional practices, butchering them. That would be the right way to tell the story cinematically.
Yeah, and perhaps one of the most tragic things, be it in a historical narrative and a cinematic adaptation, or just reading about it at all. As we discussed, the vast majority of these people were just, bystanders that just got slaughtered. Didn't even merit being executed by guillotine because they were so common and peasant that no one would show up to see. It was just to be another killing of another common person who had, what did they have to say? All they were a peasant descended from counter reformationists who someday happened to end up in a country where the capital went completely upside down, and now they're being genocided.
Yeah.
What is there to say when you're just a peasant?
Yes. Okay, just to let folks know what's coming real quick, and then we'll wrap it up. We get a little breather. Left wing terror might be best to our rhythm might work best so that we have a little breather between these episodes. We'll do something relatively light next week with Black Horse, hopefully, talking about some more current events and stuff like that. Maybe throwing some econ theory or something like that, and then we'll be back in the muck 2 weeks from today with another episode of this series on left wing terror. So wish us luck as we get through this. Pray for us, and everybody's suggestions on episodes we should cover, much appreciated. You know, so much has been lost. We don't know about all the things that have happened that that should be known, and we won't be able to cover it all in this series, but we'll try to give more than a flavor of what left wing terror has meant for the past couple hundred years in our world. So thank you, everyone. And we're going to have some credits work. In fact, I have a backup thing to do in case they don't work. Okay, here we go.